No quick draws was one prediction by commentators for round 2 between Gukesh Dommaraju and Ding Liren, the World Chess Championships, currently ongoing in Singapore. Let's see how round 2 went. Well, 1e4 was chosen by Ding Liren with his first move of the tournament with the white pieces. Slightly surprising, given prior to this, knight f3, c4, and d4 had been more well-trodden openings by Ding. However, pawn e4 was certainly not a surprise. And after pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and d3, knight f6, and then knight c3, sees the four knights Italian variation, where typically in the main line of the Juco piano, we see c3, with white's main premise being to play d4 eventually, having slowly defended that they will castle. Both sides will ferry their king to the king side typically. Pawn structures will be constructed. Escape routes for bishops will happen. This bishop will often reroute to c2 or at least retreat back to avoid being trapped by knight a5. And it's an entirely different game that clearly Ding with white decided to avoid by playing knight c3 and into the four knights variation. Thereafter, a6 was played very similarly, giving bishop a7 a possibility. And after a4, essentially stopping and grabbing some space, stopping b5, grabbing some squares, opening up for the rook potentially. There followed d6. Now, up until now, Gukesh had not necessarily seen this position prior, but was relying on his knowledge, and indeed he has a plethora of experience in this position, where often bishop g5 is seen in various positions, and as was pointed out in commentary, if both sides continue pinning to win, well, bad things can happen. For example, bishop g5, bishop g4, and after knight d5, because white is the one immediately striking, of course this is not possible, the queen dropping, if black continues to copy, it starts to favour white quite considerably as the move goes on, especially if both sides have castled prior as well. For that reason, of course, we're going to see significantly better play than that by both these players. White castled. Black refused to castle, playing h6. And notably already Ding has 10 minutes up on Gukesh, who has used 10 minutes, and Ding, of course, has used 90 seconds, so a little bit of a role reversal compared to the round 1 game from yesterday. And at this moment, it's worth noting, if pawn h3, a quite habitual copying of what black has just played, because black is yet to castle and has left their rook, as you saw in round 1, this rook was very useful, being still on the king side. g5 becomes a very topical idea where, well, certainly black is to play, or is to pick after this, because knight h2 is quasi-forced, and after g4, pawn takes, rook g8. Because of this pawn hook on h3, black has been able to run their g-pawn up the board. They will very likely win the pawn back with a lot of interest. It is technically dead level, but black is the one with a lot of energy behind his pieces, and for that reason white's king is not particularly happy. For that reason, just worth noting, h3 not so great in such scenarios. Copying can lead to bad things. For that reason, bishop e3 is played, simply developing, challenging black's powerful bishop. There's a lot of toing and throwing with structures like this that we will see throughout this middle game, and they are doubled pawns. Big thing about double pawns is the pawn in front. If it's safe, then they could not be so bad. On the other hand, they are very immobile, but in their favour as well. It opens avenues for attack, it defends key squares. Outposts for black's knights are now impossible to achieve, but they're also immobile, so it's a bit of a topsy-turvy position where it depends on taste almost. However, bishop e6 was tried by Gukesh, and at this moment it was still potentially a normal position. However, at this moment, pawn a5 was a novelty. It's never really been seen before, and showed, based on how quickly it was played, showed Ding really clamping down on some quite neat preparation, with firstly grabbing some space, and as we'll see in various endgames, this inhibits any b6 push and potentially leaves the structure on, and as we'll see, this pawn does somewhat run up the board, does leave the structure on the queen side a little bit tender, a little bit immobile. Not necessarily world-winning position, but certainly something that gives white a little bit of an edge in some positions, and certainly a fresh position that's just essentially playing chess rather than being deep in preparation. And indeed, Ding is still in preparation compared to Gukesh, who's having to think on his own. Indeed, as was later clarified, after captures, pawn captures, there followed castles, captures, captures, and the queens traded off in this position. And at this moment, white Ding Liren was still in their preparation, having moved their rook to here. Black controlled the open file with their rook, a very logical move. And now they tried a very interesting move, did Ding Liren, of rook dc1, which he later clarified he had been looking at in preparation. And it was noticed that on, I think it was the chess-based server, there had been an entry where someone had been looking at this exact position and this exact move. And the chances of it not being one of the two teams, very likely Ding Liren's team, were astronomical. And indeed, very likely this had been being looked at just yesterday with defending the pawn. And, well, if we just backtrack, because there's quite a few things to look through in this position. Firstly, in this moment, if the before castles, if this occurs on the board, yes, white's pawn structure is sabotaged, but once again, the pawn in front is relatively safe, and the avenues for attack are definitely there. And meanwhile, black will never ever achieve outposts. The best line might go as follows with knight b8, castles first, followed by queen to e1 in some positions, and then after knight to b8, we might see knight to h4, queen to g3. Black will probably respond rook to king to h7, so rook to g8 can defend any annoying mate threats, and this knight will reroute to c5, and essentially the weakness of this pawn compensates for potential activity from white. So that's why neither side really wanted to go for that. It's roughly level, but both sides elected to enter what was in this position. I'm sure Ding Liren would have been very well versed in such occurrences with the double d pawns. However, after b3, queen takes d1, rook takes d1. There followed rook a d8, challenging the only open file in the center, and Ding rather quickly, after only 9 minutes of thought, played rook dc1. The idea is to defend c2. It does surrender the open file, but let's have a quick look. The knight defends these two, the pawns defend these, and of course the rooks cover the back rank. So black can't use it too comfortably, with white's king coming to the center in some form later on to defend some squares as well, perhaps supporting the knight on d3 when it gets there. Well, this could be, dare I say, a little something for Ding to play with. There followed knight d4 and knight e1, and if we just backtrack very briefly, it's worth noting that in this position, some of the commentators, with the help of computers, had been looking at knight to e1 with the idea that after rook takes d1, black does win the a5 pawn. However, after knight d3, white has achieved their objective. There's no sensible pin because the knight is simply defending the rook on d1. And from there, this knight can now just capture, probably c5, attacking these two pawns, a lovely square for it. This knight can jump into the fray later on, and this looks pretty good for white. So as a result, knight to d7 is semi-forced, defending these squares. And from here, knight can jump into d5. And interestingly, at this moment, Ding had, in the press conference, confirmed he hadn't really looked at this. Gukesh had stopped calculating here because, well, after knight to b2, this is the critical move that perhaps is very hard to see from a far distance. It's not an obvious move. You're retreating the knight. You do attack the knight, but the knight itself on b2 doesn't look too useful. It does bounce back out to a4 in some positions, and just generally is out of the way, is reinforcing the c4 square against any potential b5s in the long distant future. But most importantly, you're opening the file. And black is a pawn up. They won on a5, but there's definite compensation with piece activity, and definitely noticeably these four are more like 3.5 versus these three, and as a result they're not too mobile. Double pawns, that's the downside, they are immobile. So very interesting perspective there brought by the computers in this position. Considered a little bit by both players, especially Gukesh, but that was not how the game went. Let's backtrack to this moment instead, where after rook dc1, knight d4, knight e1, a similar but very different position was seen very quickly. Of course, there is no fork on the e2 square. Our knight is definitely defending that. And very quickly, if black does try to distract, we simply capture the knight and the king will move. We suddenly have two knights for a rook, and we still have a rook. That's pretty important. We have a big piece, a big major piece that can do rook things, and as a result, even rook d4, we just play a move like f3. Oops, not f4, f3 to defend, or immediately capture on c5. Our knights are very strong. Two pieces are better than one. So that's not possible. And as a result, it's a very maneuvering game. And, well, in this position, rook d6 was essayed. And a very interesting moment where Vishy Anand in the commentary was pointing out that c5 can be attacked twice by this and this knight. c7 can be attacked once by a knight to d5. So the question was, how can black therefore defend? And just by asking that question, he found that perhaps this setup, knight d7, defending c5, knight e6, also defending c5, but also defending c7, could be a nice setup that matches the numbers of attack. They may look a little bit clumsy, but they're quite solid, and that would definitely be a way forward. As it is, black has something a little bit more proactive, because after rook d6, well, c5 will only be attacked by this knight if it can get to d3, and let's just play knight to d3 here. Why can't white play knight to d3? Feel free to pause the video, have a little look at this moment. It is, of course, because of this pawn being overloaded. Knight takes b3 forks, and black would now be winning after pawn takes the pawn on c2. Cannot defend both. So knight d3 becomes very, very tricky, and meanwhile this knight stands strong, attacking white structure, stopping this knight from moving, of course, anywhere forwards, because of this fork being definitely an annoyance, even though it is defended. And meanwhile, black is quite simply planning to put both rooks on the d-file, and if white cannot play a move like knight d3, then these rooks could be quite useful for black. For one thing, a very useful move might well be f3 for white, but it's distinctly possible that even the move g5 may be scared Ding from playing this, where g4 is a possibility, this rook could be lifting, a simple king h7 with a rook coming to the g-file as well. There is a world where g4 is a genuine threat to white's king. For that reason, this rook's very useful, and Ding therefore elected to play king f1. f3 was certainly a viable move, possibly even the better move, but king f1 is a very human move, walking the king over, just preventing any pawn hooks. As we saw earlier, h3 or f3 could potentially allow g4 to come with a strike, and a lot of venom on those two squares. And pawn g6, giving the king some space. I think it was once said, if in doubt, play g6, king g7, or indeed g3, king g2, and that's what black is doing, simply to walk the king up and get it a little bit closer to the center. Rook back to d1, already showing perhaps that, well, what was the plan besides this? Perhaps it could have gone to b1 and hoped for a b4 push later on. Perhaps f3 now. Knight d3, still not possible due to knight takes b3. And for that reason, rook d1, at least perhaps, starts to enable this. And after rook to d8, pawn to f3, king to g7, well, king to f2, we then saw the move h5, and it's a very tense strategical battle with a5 still being a potential weakness. Knight d3 is definitely still a possibility. But at this moment, both players entered into a threefold repetition with knight to e2, knight back to c6, knight c3, knight d4, knight e2, knight c6. And the third and final time was this moment here, where the game was agreed to draw. I think they diverged slightly from tournament etiquette of calling the arbiter over and saying my next move of knight e2 will achieve the threefold, but at the World Championship level, who cares? And as a result, the game for round 2 was agreed to draw on move 23 following the threefold repetition. And it's an interesting moment to agree a draw, because c5 is quite a weakness. A5 is also potentially weak, but probably less so than C5. So white could continue to attempt to play for a win, walking the king to the center, possibly playing G3 to support an eventual with the help of H3. A very sensible move by black to enable knight G4 in all scenarios, if ever F4. So both sides were happy with a draw, I suppose, despite potentially some attempts by white being possible at the very least. That being said, black's rooks compensate for such weaknesses, and as a result, there's a small amount of risk to white's position if they were to continue. And a draw suits Ding, of course. He's 1 point up. A draw with black for Gukesh also is pretty sensible, and that led to quite fighting talk towards the end of the press conference, where when asked about tomorrow's game, where Ding will be white, there will be black, versus Gukesh's white opening, which remains to be seen, Ding said he was ready for a fight. So very exciting chess is in store for us. Stay tuned for more. Hope you enjoyed that. Cheers.